Good evening. I'm Greer McGeary, President of Seahorse Victoria. My guest tonight is Beau Newell of Pride in Sport. Welcome, Beau. Lovely to have you along to tell us about Pride in Sport. It's part of the broader thing of pride in diversity and pride in health and part of the ACON network. So could you tell us more about what Pride in Sport is?
Thank you very much again for having me today. My name's Beau. My pronouns are he, they, and I'm the National Program Manager for Pride in Sport. And we're a part of ACON's Pride Inclusion programs. So you mentioned our partners, Pride in Diversity and Pride in Health. And I'm the lucky one who gets to head up the Pride in Sport program. And in a nutshell, we work with sporting organisations at all levels across the country around anything to do with LGBTQ inclusion.
I noticed from the website you're involved with a lot of large organisations, from the sporting clubs to other businesses that are associated with sport. So, what is it that you do with those businesses and how do they help you?
So the work that we do with all these different organisations can vary, but for the most part, our work is driven by what we call the Pride and Sport Index. So this is the national benchmarking instrument that actually allows an organisation to measure exactly how inclusive they are when it comes to LGBTQ inclusion. So, like you said, we work with quite a lot of the major sporting organisations across the country, including AFL, NRL, cricket, netball, etc. And all of these organizations use the index as their action plan or their action item tool to guide the work that they need to do. And this can vary from governance and strategy to education, community engagement. So the work we do can be varied, but like I said, everything's centrally around LGBTQ inclusion more broadly within the Australian sporting sector.
What does the index actually measure?
It's a pretty vigorous document, and like I said and alluded to, it covers off on a few different areas. So it starts around strategy, governance, and policy work that needs to happen in this space. It also captures elements of research that instruct sporting organisations to do specific education and training, as well as community engagement, and also covers off on a few different areas around research and data collection as well. And all up, there's actually about close to 40 different questions that cover off on all of these different areas. And the way that the process works is that a sporting organisation gets to choose what obviously they do, noting that some organisations have greater capacity than others. And at the end of a 12-month period, they provide their evidence to Pride in Sport as to exactly what work they have done in this space. We have independent third markers that come into the mix, and we mark the submissions of these sporting organisations. And then once all the marking is done, we acknowledge what sporting organisations have done well through different benchmarking, so they find out where they sit comparatively against other organisations of a similar kind. And we acknowledge them at the Australian Pride and Sport Awards, where they could potentially receive gold, silver, or tier bronze recognition as well.
It's interesting when you do things such as measurements and stuff like that. Do you find that the sporting organisations really do pay attention to them and do things to improve the inclusion of everyone in the alphabet community?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. I'd like to say, for the most part, the organisations that we work with are genuine and authentic about this space. And I know I'm probably biased when I say that, but it comes with the simple fact that we have an organisation that is, at the very least, reaching out to an LGBTQ subject matter expert, such as Pride in Sport, to support them in this space. And it's interesting. I quite often have a lot of conversations with senior leaders in sports, and one of the main questions that I quite often ask is, do you believe that your sporting organization is inclusive to the rainbow community? And it's interesting. I often get two different responses. One of which is a CEO or a senior leader coming at the conversation from not necessarily an arrogance perspective, but perhaps an ignorance perspective, or let's even say naive, where they like to believe that their sport is genuinely inclusive, and they say, "Yeah, absolutely, we're inclusive. We've got lesbians on our board, and we've got gay athletes that play for Australia." And you can kind of tell straight away that they're probably an organisation that needs to do a little bit more work in this space. Whereas on the other hand, if we have senior leaders that can show their vulnerability and say, look, we like to think that we're inclusive, but we know that we can do more. They're the organizations which show true, genuine work in this space and show that authenticity of, noting and acknowledging that they're not completely inclusive. They might be to a degree, but they want to do better.
The interesting thing you mentioned there about those that think or say that they're inclusive, it's very much like that. I've got some friends, therefore I must be inclusive and accepting. But we know from experience that individuals, while they might sort of be used as a token representation of a particular letter of the alphabet, and do you find that that's an issue in what you do and how you advise these organisations?
Wouldn't necessarily say it's an issue, but it can certainly be a barrier or an obstacle that we need to support the sporting organisation to overcome. And I think the reality is that a lot of this comes from a space of naivety or ignorance, in that they're just not educated. They don't have the knowledge or the know-how to create safe and inclusive environments in an authentic way. And that's not to say that sports aren't trying, but this is why we highlight the importance of working with a rainbow organisation such as Pride in Sport. And the challenge in this space too is the fact that many of these organisations, if not all sports across the country, have people from the rainbow community taking part. But it's another question to ask as to whether those people are feeling comfortable in being their true, authentic self in that specific sport.
The aspect is that because behind the scenes, at administration levels and things, it's probably not as sort of critical to the organisation as such, the various sporting organisations. But the public perception is always the team, who are the members of the actual football team or netball team or the rugby team, in supporting individuals who partake in that sport. How does your organisation support the actual public version of those sporting organisations?
Good question. And I think this kind of goes to the uniqueness of every sporting organisation and them acknowledging what they need to do or even what they want to do in this space. But one of the drivers, and this kind of comes through the education that we do with these organisations, is making sure that they take an approach that is a person-centered approach. So acknowledging that, we know statistically within Australia that a lot of people from the rainbow community will expend, energy hiding who they truly are, and that can be anywhere up to 30% of their daily energy being used to hide their true self. And we quite often talk to sporting organisations about this self-editing. And it's interesting, some of the key points, if we're talking about athletes, for example, is making them understand that if you have an athlete who is self-editing 30% of their daily energy, hiding who they truly are, that's the difference between a gold medal at the Olympics and not even getting selected for the Olympics to begin with. And so when you start to talk with sporting organizations in that way, it becomes a lot clearer as to why this work is important and why we would need to do work to create safe and inclusive environment.
Just from the personal aspect of dealing with this side of my life a number of years ago, that sort of self-editing is something that a lot of us have put up with just in day-to-day life. And I did express in a number of conversations I've had that I was the incoming president of an organisation back in the 90s and had this sensation when giving my first speech to the club that I just, only if they could see me, and it wasn't me dressed in a dress or with long blonde hair, but I just felt like I wasn't wholly there. Sort of I was standing behind my own mask and always felt just that little bit restricted in how I expressed myself.
I think most, if not all, people within the rainbow community probably could relate to this, couldn't they? And it's interesting. Some of the conversations that I've had with sports, and I've previously done a TEDx style talk to a lot of sporting organisations, talking about my own experience. And I can speak from the idea that I've self-edited significantly. Like when I first started working in the sporting sector, I tell people that it was like having my honeymoon before I even started working in the job itself. And then as soon as I hit the ground running on my very first day of working in a sporting organization, I realized quite quickly that, hang on, this environment isn't completely safe for me. And for what it's worth, I had a number of fears, and I self-edited to a significant degree, so much so that I was making sure that I wouldn't say words like fabulous or spectacular in conversations with my colleagues, and I wouldn't wave my hand in a particular fashion. And even to the point where I had stereotypes, going and meeting people from committees of grassroots community clubs, thinking that, I need to be conscious about what I say and what I do. And heaven forbid, if they ask me what drink I want, I have to order a Coke or a beer, because if I order a raspberry lemonade, I'm going to be laughed at by everyone. And I say this to everyone, full disclosure: if you ever see me at a pub, buy me a raspberry lemonade, because I love them and I'm not afraid to say it anymore.
A classic sort of feeling I think a lot of people have when they're hiding things. That they look at those stereotypes, and quite often the stereotype is really an artificial well, it is an artificial construct of the environment, isn't it? And I like this story that you tell there, because it in some ways matches myself, particularly in my later years, where I did self-edit, and you just sort of try to act without sort of giving away too much that there might be something different in your life.
And isn't that the challenge for so many of us? And look, I think this is actually one of those critical things that sporting administrators, they need to hear these stories, because quite often, like I said, you have leaders of sports naively thinking that they're an inclusive environment just because they know of a gay athlete, or they've got a lesbian on the board, or they know someone from the community that plays their sport at community level. And this is the critical part, that if we share these stories, sporting administrators can start to learn that, hang on, their sport may not actually be as inclusive as what they once thought. And that's not necessarily to degrade the sport, or to say that they're not doing a good job in lots of different areas, but it just highlights the fact that everyone's journey is unique, everyone's experience is different. When it comes to self-vetting and hiding themselves. Um, and I've also learned that for sports, they're inherently competitive, aren't they? That's just the nature of sport, is that they want to compete, they want to come first, they want to get the gold medal. And if you start to share news and information with sports about lived experience of LGBTQ athletes, you can quite often see and understand from those experiences that it could be simple things that organization can do to create that safe and inclusive environment. I mean, in our training, we quite often, do a lot of education around trans and gender diverse inclusion at the moment. And a slight content warning: one of the things that we often share is some of the sad statistics when it comes to suicide ideation, anxiety, and depression. Um, and I hate to say it, but in a way, it's actually much of a wake up call for a lot of sporting organisations to know that the effort that they've currently been putting in needs to be amplified if you're genuinely going to create that safe and inclusive environment.
That's one of those areas that is very important. And I might just sort of use the example of, say, like the AFL with AFLW and the NRL with the NRLW, the the difference in how the actual teams seem to have handled it themselves. The AFLW was very uh, upfront and open about the various sexualities and relationships within playing groups. Do you find that works to your advantage when you're talking to other organisations?
I think it's an important thing to share the stories and share the experiences. So if I'm working with one sporting organisation, and so long as it's in the public domain, or we're allowed to, certainly sharing the experiences of another organisation is good. But I think it's also important to point out that there's still unique challenges. So if we use the example of AFLW and the AFL men's competition, for example, quite a lot of people just immediately assume that the AFLW is more inclusive and there's less barriers or challenges because they might see more out athletes or because they have a competition wide, pride round. Um, and to a degree, that's true. There is a lot more levels of inclusivity, if I could put it that way, in a lot of female competitions. But that doesn't mean that they come without additional barriers. And we know statistically, for example, out lesbians and out queer women in sport often faced a lot of extra stigma. And research tells us that there's quite a lot of stigma attached to female athletes. And the idea or this concept that if I'm a parent of a young girl, I don't want my young girl to be playing in that particular women's team because they'll turn her gay or they'll turn him to lesbian. And that stigma is challenging, and it's not obviously unique to that portion of the population. Everyone has a different stigmas attached in this, but I guess this just highlights the complexity of work that needs to be done in this space with sport.
Yeah, that was an interesting point that you made there about, it's one of those areas you tend not to think about, is because the higher profile within a particular sport or in any other area of life, that the decisions that people are making with younger people about whether you participate in that sport or go to some other sport is one that's not really thought about or talked about openly. And so when you talk to the various organisations, are you always just talking to the very high level, or are you talking to?
I think our first lot of conversations tend to come from a champion, and that could be a senior leader, it could be a diversity inclusion expert or lead, or it could be someone working in community. That's usually where the first lot of conversations come from. But the hope or the idea of the way that we operate is that we are able to engage with all levels. And I think particularly the way that Pride in Sport operates is an evidence based approach, and we know that quite a lot of research points out that we need that buy-in from senior leadership. So for an extensive part of the work that we do is working with those senior leaders of sports across all different organisations. But so too is the importance of working with people right at grassroots and community level. And this goes to that simple concept that if we want to create this inclusive space, we need buy-in from every level of sport. So, from grassroots volunteers, people working in the canteen or marking the fields out, all the way up to the senior leaders and CEOs and board members of the largest sporting organisations in the country.
At that sort of grassroots community level, what are the sort of responses that you're getting from the administration of each of the, say, clubs and slightly higher level at competition level?
I think buy-in is a lot quicker at community level. I think community sports are more not necessarily more interested, but they're more able to dive into this space, if I can say it that way, in terms of working on LGBTQ inclusion. And I think the reason for that is one of which there's a lot of less red tape in the idea that if you're working with a large sporting corporation, they have to go through all of the different checks and balances and appease and make sure that their board members are happy. Whereas if you're working with community level, you're usually engaged with the community straight away. So there's not necessarily that power imbalance as there is at big sporting corporations. So much so that your president and your secretary and treasurer of your local community club might even be a part of the rainbow community, and there's a lot more connection to family. And we often talk about community sports providing that space of belonging, and so it's much easier, in my opinion, for community sports to do work in this space. But again, some sports do it better than others.
One of the things that I sort of notice, and a couple of people I know do play at community level, and being from the trans community, it's really doing their mental health really a lot of benefit because they are able to participate in the sports that they've loved. But we've seen, without sort of getting too political about it, the anti-trans that's sort of sprung up worldwide, particularly from a couple of countries overseas. It's having an enormous impact here in Australia as well. How is that sort of playing into what Pride in Sport is being able to, talk to these organisations about trans in sport?
Yeah, really good question. And I think the quick answer to this is that it is an ever evolving space. The conversations that we were having with sporting organisations 3 years ago around trans and gender diverse inclusion is different to what it is today. And I think for the most part, it's important to point out that um, most sporting administrators that we're working with through the Pride in Sport program are actually wanting to be inclusive. They're wanting to be inclusive to the trans and gender diverse community. They just don't know how. And I say that not necessarily because they're oblivious to the fact that, those from the trans community are just human beings like the rest of us. It's more centralized or focused around, their policies or their processes and them not necessarily wanting to get it wrong. And we can sit here and talk about this until the cows come home, but I think there's a lot of sporting organizations that are genuinely wanting to be inclusive, and now we're starting to see more sports take that leadership role in creating an environment where anyone from any background, let alone the transgender diverse community, can participate at grassroots level without the fear of discrimination or harassment or bullying or transphobia. um, but that doesn't necessarily come about without governance and without policies and procedures. And that's where I guess a lot of the critical work is happening for us at the moment, is making sure that sports are equipped and have the tools and resources necessary so that they can provide these safe spaces. And again, this goes back to our original point. Our number one piece of advice for any sporting organisation, whether you're a community club or a major league professional competition, is to have that person-centered approach. Treat every individual as a human being first, and their experiences second. And if you do that, you then start to create these environments where people can express themselves and be their true, authentic individual self in any sport that they want to participate in.
Some of the sporting bodies like Sports Australia and those organisations that sort of like the Olympic committees and that sort of set standards for sports. How involved are you with those sorts of organisations?
Our involvement can vary from different organisation to different organisation. What I can share is that, we were a part of the worldwide consultation from the International Olympic Committee a number of years ago to move away from their one size fits all policy. And from our perspective, that's a good thing because we realise that, having one particular policy applicable to every type of sporting entity that there is isn't fit for purpose. So we saw what happened with the IOC, and that now they encourage sports to have sport-specific policies. And I think this is important, but there is also an extensive amount of work that needs to go into it too, because if you take the simple fact that there are some sports which are team sport, there's some sports that are individual sports, some are high contact, some are combat sports, some are more motor sports, some are animal use sports like equestrian and horse riding. So the dynamic for every individual sport is really unique, and it's important to take that into consideration. But the one thing that we will encourage and always encourage sports to do is to try and take that inclusive approach first. Um, so come into the conversation about how can we include more people into our sport? How can we have more athletes playing our sport? And if you come at it from that perception or that lens, you start to understand and create more space for people to be their authentic self. And this is what we're seeing in quite a number of sports across the country as it is. And they're starting to make sport-specific policies and guidelines around trans and gender diverse inclusion. And the ones that are taking that approach, we're seeing more people want to participate in that sport. So it goes to the concept that we alluded to before, in that if a sport can show that they're inclusive, those from the rainbow community and transgender diverse community in particular will be more inclined to want to take part in that sport as well.
In dealing with the organisations, that touches upon then what discussions do you have with the political side of the world, politicians and governments and the like?
I think most of our work is focused around sports. But having said that, we're not specifically an advocacy organisation. Our primary purpose is to work with sporting entities. But there is there's often a lot of conversations that we see pop up in the media, and because we are considered subject matter experts, in LGBTQ inclusion in sport, we're quite often asked for comment and asked for our opinion on different things. So, for example, when we see, a lot of unfortunate media attention on a trans athlete playing in a particular sport, and then you have an outspoken, elite male athlete that considers that, that's them or that particular sport, they're ruining the sanctity of female sport, and we don't want biological men playing in women's sports. And a lot of that information, a lot of their approach in this sort of stuff comes at a place of bias and a place of misinformation. And our job is really to try and debunk a lot of the myths that these people have. So in terms of who we engage with and when we engage, it can vary quite substantially from one sport or one moment to the next. But I think it comes back into our main purpose is that so long as we can engage with the sporting administrators, they're the ones who make the rules for their sport, not politicians, not advocates from any side, not necessarily any sort of person from anti-trans groups. They don't have the ability to make specific policies. It's the sporting administrators that do that. And if we can effectively engage with them and educate them and show them, what it means to be an inclusive sport, I've never met a sporting organisation yet that doesn't want more people to take part in their sport. So this comes again from that inclusive approach.
You touched on a couple of things there, which has been of concern to me and many others, is the use of particular type of language to describe trans people, because it's not just male to female, there's also female to male. And, in every human life, whether they're in the rainbow community or not, everyone's an individual and no one's exactly the same. And the other thing there was, how these high profile people sort of push against, somebody else's view of the world, and use that language to sort of basically denigrate people. So it's good to see that you're having those conversations with the organisation and administrators.
It's absolutely important, and it's an integral, not even just for us to have those conversations with sports, but everyone. If you're a part of a particular sport, even whether you're just a community player at a local club, you have a voice in your respective sporting code. So, if you're comfortable, we encourage those people to speak up. And I think you're right in that, unfortunately, we will hear for many years to come, the opinions of and voices of people who just aren't educated and just don't have a lot of understanding of what it means to be inclusive for the trans and gender diverse community. And as long as that happens, we'll have a space for pride and sport in this area to advocate and to promote safe and inclusive environments for all of the rainbow community. And I think this again goes to that importance of, why sporting administrators need to be engaged with organisations like ourselves, is because, the fundamental principle is that it's about having more people be physically active. And, in lieu of not having sufficient amount of research around trans and gender diverse inclusion in sport, we do have a sufficient amount of research that points to the idea that anyone participates in sport, their physical health improves, their mental health improves, their overall well-being improves. And this, again, is just that fundamental nature of what sport is. So who wouldn't want people to be safe, happy and healthy in this country? That's where we kind of often go to.
I think that was really a wonderful way to probably conclude our conversation today, because that's what we're all wanting to be, is included in society, be healthy, happy, and feel that we are valued for who we are. And sport obviously provides that overall well-being from young age right through to late adult age. So thank you for taking part in the conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me. And look, and again, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to share our voice. Like I said, the one thing that I'd probably leave everyone with as well is, if you're wanting to create this safe and inclusive environment, if you want your sport to do more, reach out to Pride in Sport, have your organisation take part in our index, and let us work with your organisation to create that safe and inclusive environment. Because if we have more people, happy and healthy in this country, we won't need a need for our sport, we won't need a need for Pride in Sport. That's the ultimate goal for us. But for now, we're here to help. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Beau. And I'm Graham Aguirre. My guest has been Beau Newell of Pride in Sport.